जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल गंगा। विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा। तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मागे। गाहे तव जय गाथा जनगण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता। जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे।
Good morning and welcome to the plenary session of the 50th SKOCH Summit. We have a very distinguished panel with us this morning. As the chief guest this morning, we have none other than Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. We have Lavish Bhandari, very eminent economist. We have Ratan Roy, who is heading NIPFP, is also part-time member of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and we have Dr. Deepak B. Phatak. So let me invite Dr. Phatak to make his opening remarks.
Good morning to all of you. I'm particularly happy to see a lot of youngsters who participated in the Samavesh program and are training themselves to become the economic drivers of the future country's progress. Today's sessions, as Samir said, are extremely important. Try to pay attention to the in-depth analysis that you will see through several keynotes in the plenary session as well as in the subsequent sessions. I'd like to remind you that this 50th edition of SKOCH Summit brings to you not only what is happening here, but the plethora of knowledge gained over last 49 editions, where people have been recognized from all walks of life, not only including those who have contributed at the senior-most level of policy making, but also those who have worked at the grassroots levels, making achievements possible with small means and yet with grit and determination. And I believe this is what defines the future of the country. All the best, and thank you so much.
With that, I would like to invite Dr. Bibek Debroy to receive this year's Golden Jubilee Scotch Challenger Award. In fact, it's not this year, it's across our 50 conferences for his work in inclusion and economics.
Debroy, Chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Golden Jubilee Scotch Challenger Award for Inclusion and Economics. Bibek Debroy is the rare economist with a heart, drawing evidence-based conclusions with a teacher-like clarity of thought. He has been able to bring a felt needs perspective to his work that spans across large areas of economics, reforms, and governance. As a scholar and an academic, he has published 100 books over and above his translations of great Sanskrit epics. He believes in taking inputs based on felt needs and is someone who has the last person in the queue in sight. This has also reflected in his recommendations for railway reform, where he chose to leave the ivory tower and travel along the track to interact with station masters, officers, operational staff, and railway employees alike to understand their perspectives. What sets Bibek apart is his deep understanding of issues that are faced by the nation across centre and states, coupled with his academic expertise, which has enabled him to unleash widespread reforms across areas of legal, labour, and rural development in various states, including Rajasthan, Jharkhand, and Jammu and Kashmir. A firm believer in inclusive growth and the most appropriate choice for Chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Bibek's own thinking is completely aligned with the idea of Modinomics, inclusive economics, inclusive governance.
And what more appropriate, the award is being given by the hands of a teacher, Dr. Deepak B. Phatak, and we have so many beneficiaries of Bibek's work on inclusion and economics. You may not know Bibek, but there are so many lives that get touched across India, specifically rural India, through the great policy work that people like you do, the felt needs that you bring to the table. Economists and being emotional is an oxymoron, but you are the first warm economist, an economist with a heart that I've ever known.
I like that. Congratulations. Thank you.
Make sure he carries it back with him.
Thank you. So very nice.
Thank you so much.
Vivek, this was special for you. I've never seen it in last week.
I have not seen it. So Dr. Suresh Prabhu could not join us this morning because of his busy schedule, but he has sent us a message. We would now be playing that message for you.
Enhancing Indian investment is an opportunity for us. We are already working on India's largest citizenship summit, which is taking place, in which we are going to find out how can we promote more and more investment to India. India economy will be $5 trillion economy in the next few years' time. India needs investment in a massive scale, because more the investment, more the rate of growth will be faster. To get investment, we'll have to promote savings. Savings and investment go hand in hand, but just putting savings into investment, unless we bring efficiency of investment, will not give us the desired benefit. So we must use the capital in a most efficient manner, so that the output ratio, capital outcome ratio will be very, very efficient. To do that, we need entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs use the capital in the most efficient manner and try to promote economic growth. So let me offer you my best wishes. I wish I could attend, but I am not able to join you because of my other participation. but I thank you very much.
It is indeed a pleasure for me that the School of earlier Scotch Challenger awardees, including the Lifetime Achievement awardees, decided this year that the Golden Jubilee Award for Inclusion in Economics is deserved none other by Dr. Bibek Debroy. In fact, the person who proposed the award and was championing it was none other than one of the tallest figures in Indian economic history, which was Dr. Vijay Kelkar himself. So, big round of applause for that. In fact, just to share with you, when the whole process started, we were looking at candidates for public finance, and Dr. Kelkar said that, Bibek's work goes far, far beyond public finance. He's a guy who's worked on governance reforms, he's a person who's worked on railway reforms, he's a person who's, brought a sense of realism into policy making. There are very few people who've gone through the kind of cycle that Bibek has gone through. In his earlier works, he worked with Dr. Dandekar, and that is where I think he picked up that without data, policy making is in a vacuum. So he brought in a sense of realism to policy making. He went on to teach students who were MBA students. So he is able to now simplify and put a common sense perspective into economic policy making in the country. Those of you who were there yesterday evening would know that I met him for the first time when Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer had taken a delegation from India to Pakistan for a conference in Panchayati Raj. Round of applause for Mr. BJ Panda, who just joined us. And that was the time when we were working on this concept of rural business hubs. How do you economically enable rural India? And at that time, I think Mani told me that there is nobody else that he knows with the intellectual bandwidth who can actually map these rural hubs across India and look at the business potential. And that was very commendable work. And it's really humble of Bibek to not even consider that as one of his contributions. He just says that this is just a subject that I write about. But his contributions to the third tier of governance are also second to none compared to his contributions in all other areas that there is. Bibek, of course, has been involved with the Scotch Foundation from our early days. So his thinking has very greatly impacted the way Scotch itself works. Scotch is essentially a ragtag bunch of illiterate guys. So he was the most qualified person when we started to give us bearings. Obviously, he was not a part of Scotch formally, but from the outside, he was a mentor and a guide. And he gave us the first socio-economic bearings that so assiduously we follow today. And I was really pleased when he was chosen by Shri Narendra Modi as chairman of his Economic Advisory Council, because I had written a book called Modinomics, which was released before the elections. And the book was all about how Modinomics is all about inclusive governance and inclusive economics, as different than only pure economics. And I don't think there could have been a worthier candidate than Bibek Debroy to exemplify the concept of Modinomics, which is inclusive economics and inclusive governance. So another round of applause for him to that. So all the people who've come from all across country, if you ever get a frustrated feeling that nobody is voicing your concerns at the policy table, remember that there is a person called Dr. Bibek Debroy who understands your points of pain and is representing all of you, all of us, our combined aspirations for a new India at the policy table in India. It also happens to be the 50th Scotch Summit, which is our Golden Jubilee. So obviously it's a time to reflect what is it that we have achieved over these 50 conferences. I think the biggest achievements that I consider, is what I call my beacons of hope. One such beacon of hope is Dr. Saraswati Hari Sankaran, who's sitting right here in the front row. Madam, if you would just let yourself be seen, if it's not too inconvenient to stand up, for a very big round of applause for her. Mrs. Hari Sankaran, she's 80 years old. She understands felt needs as nobody else. At a loss of her own people, in her members in her own immediate family, at this age of 80, she's untiringly working for the causes of against drunken driving, against tobacco, against cancer, against infant mortality. And you would wonder that why somebody like her, with the kind of background that she comes from, is so concerned. I think this is what makes India great, and we have many such beacons of hope. We also have another beacon of hope this morning, which is Mr. BJ Panda. We have who's a member of Parliament, and he's very much unlike. I think he's a role model for what a member of Parliament should look like. He's extremely well researched. His opinion is never off the cuff. Again, he's one person. What he has in common with Bibek is he is able to bring the felt needs of the people to the policy table, and he understands both sides, the people side and the policy side, extremely well, and he's been able to introduce a lot of private members' bill. We will talk about and hear about his achievements a lot more. Well, the biggest beacons of hope I have is 150 people who are from rural India, who are sitting here in this room, and who are trying to make India better by upgrading their skills. There are people who are village level entrepreneurs who are giving common citizen services to people across the country. There are people who are skill upgrading on financial literacy, trying to understand Mudra Yojana, Jan Dhan Yojana, Atal Bima Yojana, pension scheme, so that they can go and talk about these things. While it is government job to introduce these wonderful schemes, but the schemes don't become known or successful on their own. So we have these 150 beacons of hope who are carrying forward this message of new India and what is it that is available as a right to people of India, to rural India, and teaching them and encompassing them in this quest for a new and better India. As I mentioned yesterday, I am a product of poverty, but for the reforms that all these people unleashed in India, people like Bibek, people like Yashwant Sinha, people like P. Chidambaram, people like Venkaiah Naidu, I still would have been poor. So it has been my privilege to document the reform history of India. It has been my privilege to have a ringside view of what changed, and I see that as a continuum. So while people who were poor 25 years back, like me today, are middle class or upper middle class, I see the same transition happening. In the past 25 years, over 200 million Indians have been uplifted from poverty, and that continuum is carrying on. I believe the biggest enemy that all of us face together is one, which is poverty. Everything else, that's the mother problem. Every other problem actually is a subset of the poverty problem. And everything that we do at Scotch and we believe in is that we have to try and defeat poverty in our lifetime. We are doing 50th Scotch Summit, but since we have increased the pace, we do 4 of them in a year. So I do hope, or I do plan to be with you at the 100th Scotch Summit, which is not going to take 50 years. And when we look back on the 100th Scotch Summit, all of us will proudly say, India has defeated poverty, India has defeated cancer, India has defeated infant mortality, India has devolved funds, functionaries and finances to the 3rd tier. And all of us did that together. With that, a big round of applause for all of us in this room. Standing ovation, please. Please stand up. And as you stand up and clap, I invite Bibek Debroy, who is the most firm, deserving candidate of this standing ovation, to come and give his address while you are applauding. Stop only once he starts speaking. Bibek.
Dr. Pathak, Mr. Panda, Sameer Kochar, Dr. Rathin Roy, Dr. Lavish Bhandari, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am honored and humbled at the decision of the Scotch Foundation to confer this award on me. I am also somewhat delighted because traditionally when such awards have been conferred, they have tended to say lifetime awards. So I am grateful that it does not say a lifetime award. Sameer Kochar is someone whom you know very well, and therefore you are also aware that Sameer generally tends to tell you what he wants you to speak about. He doesn't leave it to you. So he has thrust a topic on me which says India towards a 10 trillion US dollar economy. Now this is something on which one can go on for hours and hours. I don't have hours and hours. I have about 15 minutes to make some stray remarks on this particular topic. So therefore, I shall do that almost in bulleted fashion. First of all, notice that though it says towards a $10 trillion economy, it does not mention the timeline. Obviously, if we wait long enough, somewhere down the line in the unforeseeable future, India will become a $10 trillion economy. But that's neither here nor there. What is important is to try and pin down what kind of timeline we have in mind. And I think there are two kinds of timelines which are implicit in that statement. The first one is 2030, and the second one happens to be 2040. Remember those 2 years, 2030 and 2040, and I will come back to those. Let me now return to where the Honorable Minister for Commerce and Industry left off, because that is the way most economists and some of my fraternity and sorority are represented here, including here on the panel. Most economists will tend to think of it in terms of inputs: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And one of the issues we are talking about is a greater degree of input usage to generate growth, and related to that, B, a greater efficiency in the use of those inputs. Take, for instance, land. We know land is a contentious issue, but we also know that land is very inefficiently used in India. When I say land is inefficiently used, there are a whole bundle of issues connected with land. It's not only about ownership of land, as people sometimes tend to think, because land is, after all, a bundle of rights. And the fact of the matter is, it is inefficiently used because we don't even have a system of very clear land titling. If you do not have a very clear system of land titling, you cannot really think in terms of converting that land into some kind of productive use. And one of the things I just want to mention in passing is that there are several initiatives that are going on to improve the land titling part of it, cleaning up land records, all of which facilitates more efficient usage of land, more conversion of land for more productive purposes, also facilitates urbanization. And worldwide, urbanization tends to be correlated with economic growth and economic development. Traditionally, India has had very low rates of urbanization. The rates of urbanization have been going up, and indeed that urbanization needs to be better managed. Most of the time when we complain about urbanization, we are not per se complaining about urbanization, we are complaining about the form that urbanization takes. From land, let me move on to labor. On labor too, we are talking about a whole variety of issues. It is not only about labor laws as sometimes is interpreted in terms of the Industrial Disputes Act, specifically Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. That's a very small, tiny bit. Labor is also about other labor laws. Labor is also about breaking down the traditional dichotomy that has existed between organized labor on one side and unorganized labor on the other side. We have a system where there are very stringent labor laws which protect a very small segment of the workforce, and there is the other segment which is about 92%, which is outside the purview of any kind of protection. To the extent that protection exists in the form of legislation, it is rarely enforced. We are talking about education, we are talking about skills, we are talking about increasing the participation of women in the workforce. If the participation of women in the workforce in India were to even remotely approach the levels in East Asia, the path to that $10 trillion would become easier. The third set of issues is capital, and again the Honorable Minister mentioned this. Here also we are talking about increases in savings rate, fueled by income growth, fueled by more people moving into higher income growth, higher income levels. We are talking about the young population, the so-called demographic dividend, which also feeds into the process. We are talking about investments, not only domestic but also foreign, which improves enhances the capital. And of course, the competition. And notice, after a very, very long time, the exit of capital has begun to happen. Competition does not only mean entry, it also requires exit. That, therefore, fuels a greater degree of efficiency in the use of capital. As the Minister said, it brings down what economists call the capital output ratio, or the incremental capital output ratio. And then in those traditional growth theory terms, we have entrepreneurship, which is something that economists and other people find very difficult to understand and pin down, but if you travel across India, you will get this sense of entrepreneurship happening. More and more people are not seeking government jobs. More and more people are not seeking jobs. More and more people are seeking to provide others jobs. In addition to these, let me now mention 4 other bulleted points. The first one is a purely statistical one. It's a purely statistical one because the share of agriculture in national income is declining. narrowly defined agriculture. And if the share of agriculture in national income declines, and agriculture does not grow as fast as what are called the secondary or the tertiary sectors, automatically this gives an additional impetus to overall GDP growth. But the next one that I want to mention is even more important, and it is rarely talked about, and that is a change in the institutional system. When we talk about markets, markets do not function in a vacuum. Markets function in a certain institutional context. And down the years, India has been too centralized. There are all kinds of legacy issues connected with the way we inherited a post-colonial kind of system. For the first time, that institutional reform is happening. Also part of that institutional reform is the legal system. The legal system is also in some sense part of the infrastructure, and if the legal system does not deliver satisfactorily, then obviously you cannot have growth and development. Linked to that is the issue of decentralization and the role of the states. If one looks at the trajectory of India's growth since 1991, the first decade contrasts very neatly with what happened in the subsequent decades. In the first decade following 1991, that particular decade of the 90s, the states which grew really fast were the traditionally regarded forward states. What has begun to change since the 2000s is the fact that many of the traditionally backward states have begun to grow faster. And in many of these states, there is plenty of slack in the system because, as I said earlier, the land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship labor is not efficiently used. And there is enough slack in that system for the traditionally backward states to drive that growth impetus. The next point I want to make is a point that's already been mentioned, which is the citizen involvement in the process. To my mind, the citizen involvement in the process of governance and development began to happen towards the second half of the 80s. It may have increased in importance in recent years, but that's when it really began to happen. All of these fuel that process, trigger that process towards that $10 trillion economy. Growth tends to have an exponential kind of angle, which sometimes is very difficult to appreciate. Today, if I sit down with that base and I look at 2030, in the year 2030, India's overall national income, depending on your growth assumptions, will be somewhere between 6.5 to 7 trillion US dollars. 2030, somewhere between 6.5 to 7 trillion US dollars, depending on the growth assumptions you are making. So by 2030, we will fall short of that 10 trillion. However, there is one bit that economists find very difficult to predict, and that bit is a bit about what happens to the exchange rate. If you go back and read the first Goldman Sachs report on BRICS and their projections, about 1/3 of that increase was because of an appreciation in the exchange rate. So if the exchange rate is what it is today, then 6.5 to 7 trillion in 2030, 10 trillion in the decade of the leading up to 2040, perhaps around 2035. If the exchange rate appreciates, perhaps we'll get there faster. But all of this is about the overall macroeconomy. Some of you are aware of the work, even though you may not know him by name, of Professor Madison and his followers and successors and colleagues who have tried to drag back economic development in the world to something like 1 AD, 1 ACE. And you will also be aware that there are reports suggesting that India accounted for a very, very large share of world GDP then. Indeed, it did. But that was in the aggregate. If you go back and look at that kind of work, the per capita income in India wasn't remarkably higher than that in, let's say, Western Europe. So here also, when we are talking about 10 trillion, we are talking about the overall size, and size does matter. And it is because of the size that India's role in terms of global economic clout will also enhance considerably as we move towards that 10 trillion. But behind that 10 trillion is a per capita figure. And that per capita figure, depending on your assumptions, around the year 2030 will be about $4,000. Is $4,000 high or low? Depends on what kind of comparisons you're making with whom. $4,000 in 2030 will still be less than that in many countries in the world. $4,000 means India will still be relatively poor, although the nature of the poverty then in India will be completely different. 2030 is what? It's 13 years away. Cast your mind back to what India was like 13 years ago and ask yourself, 13 years ago, would you have been able to predict the kind of changes that have happened in India? The answer is no. These changes are impossible to predict with any degree of certainty. What is certain is that 10 trillion, 7 trillion, $4,000 per capita in the year 2030, India will be a remarkably different country. Last sentence, last point. To me, the story of India is the following. It is imperfectly understood in terms of rural-urban. It is imperfectly understood in terms of states. To me, what is happening in India is there are 600,000 villages. Before the last 20 years, about 150,000 were already integrated into the so-called mainstream. In the last 20 odd years, perhaps another 250,000 have now got integrated. And that is inclusion in all of its different senses. Transport, financial, all of it. The story of the next 13 years will be the ones that have not so far been brought into the mainstream, being brought into the mainstream. And it is that transformation which will really change the face of India. The integration of the 150,000 villages, the smaller villages which are still not integrated. Thank you once again, Scotch. Thank you once again, Samir. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Bibek, for giving us that hope. as you know that we have many Scotch awards. Then we have an award called the Scotch Challenger Award. Most of our awards are competitive in nature, in the sense that people need to compete through nominations, jury evaluations, expert voting, delegate voting, so on and so forth. And quite a few of you present in this room have gone through that process. Then we have the Scotch Challenger Award, which is a non-competitive award. It is decided by a collegium of the earlier Scotch Challenger Award winners, who nominate and select who the next awardee ought to be. And the difference essentially doesn't stop there. Scotch Challenger Award has got two additional benefits. One is that people who win the award have to come home and eat food that I cook. And I think Meghnad Desai is already here, and he's already been through that ordeal. And Bibek will have to, and I'm sure Mr. Panda would have to go through the same. And the second is, given the fact that it is a Golden Jubilee Scotch Challenger Award, I would invite Meghnad to come and give away the Golden Jubilee trophy to Bibek Debroy, and also say a few words about him. Lord Meghnad Desai, please. Lord Meghnad Desai was one of, I think, our first or second Scotch Challenger awardee for the award Excellence in Economics, and I am delighted that he happens to be in India, and he was also is part of the collegium which decides the next award, and it's a pleasure that Bibek could get the trophy through his hand, and I request him to say a few words about Bibek.
Thank you very much, Samir. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to be here, and even more of a pleasure to be able to give an award, and even greater pleasure to give it to my friend Bibek Debroy. I mean, Bibek is, even by usual standards, an extraordinarily diverse, polymathic individual. I mean, economics is just his hobby. I mean, he does, he runs the country in economic ways, but I think that's just a minor distraction. He has done this most enormous task of translating the Mahabharata, and I think we really have to understand that, people have spent their whole lifetime trying to do the Mahabharata and, disappeared in the process, and he has very successfully done that and has gone on, not resting on his laurels. He has gone on to do further translations of the Harivansha, and then he's now, I'm told, on the Puranas, and I think the Puranas will be defeated by Bibek Debroy. He will get them sorted out as well. But of course, it is his economics that we are honoring, and I think over the years, whenever I have heard Bibek speak, it's always been something that I have never thought about, that people haven't quite understood his deep knowledge of how the Indian economy works in a practical way, but also within a conceptual framework. It's always been astonishing. And, I'm so pleased that at last the country has recognized the value of his knowledge and how his knowledge can serve, can help the country achieve better things. And so I'm sort of doubly and triply pleased that we are giving this award to Bibek Debroy, that he's doing fantastic work, and that we are all hoping that the nation will benefit enormously from what he has done, and I wish him good luck. Thank you very much.
So now is the time to honor another brilliant son of India, a person that I believe in this generation of MPs is most likely to be a future finance minister of India. It's none other than Mr. Panda, and I invite him to receive his award, and I invite Bibek and Dr. Phatak and Meghnad to join us. Please.
Baijayant J. Panda, Member of Parliament, Lok Sabha. Scotch Challenger Award for Parliamentary Person of the Year. Baijayant J. Panda, who represents the new face of Indian politicians, is made of a different metal. Like others, he is critical. But unlike others, he is constructive. Politics for him is a way to serve the nation, which he chose consciously over a lucrative corporate career. He has been advocating for institutional reforms, judicial reforms for gender safety, governance reforms for social justice, a free market economy, and universal basic income to hit at the root of poverty. He is one parliamentarian who has introduced a large number of private members' bills, including those for data protection, vehicular pollution reduction, whistleblowers protection amendment, and so on. He believes in the role that Fourth Estate can play in strengthening the democracy and has on several occasions counselled the national media to be more tolerant and forthright. Whether on the floor of the House or in public, Jai Panda's passion to espouse the cause of Odisha and other national issues such as development, education and information technology comes shining through. He favours the widening of income tax base, net neutrality and a level playing field between minor and major players in the telecom and e-commerce sectors.
On behalf of Scotch Foundation, I invite Dr. Phatak to present a shawl to Mr. Panda. I invite Mr. Panda to say a few words, please.
Mr. Samir Kochar, Lord Meghnad Desai, Shri Bibek Debroy, Shri Phatak, Shri Ratin Roy, Shri Bhandari, many distinguished personages in the audience and delegates. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be given this recognition by the Scotch Foundation, which has been conducting not only these seminars and conferences that we have been participating in, but recognizing and awarding honors in different fields as we have just seen. I have been asked to speak on a job-generative economic agenda. Let me take a few minutes to cover a few of the following grounds. I believe that jobs are the single biggest challenge that we face today, and not just in India. I believe it is a problem that is global. There are dire warnings coming out from multilateral organizations like the World Bank, from pundits and commentators around the world, that due to automation, machine learning, technology, jobs as we have known it are going to be available in much less numbers, much fewer numbers throughout the world. The World Bank, in fact, has said that something like 68% of jobs, existing jobs in India, are at risk of being obsolete because of technology. The challenge in other countries is also similar, some a little less and some a little more than that shocking 68% number. But I would like to take a few minutes to talk about how we have reached where we have reached. If you turn the clock back, as Bibek Debroy did a couple of centuries, it is an oft-repeated statistic that India represented something like a quarter of world GDP as late as the 18th century. But we don't need to go that far. Even as a developing poor nation in the 20th century, in modern times, there are some stark statistics. I would like to compare ourselves with China, which is the only other country that has more than 1 billion population. Now, in the 7 decades since we achieved independence, we have established not only the world's largest democracy in the history of the world, but one that is respected, one that is held up to as an icon around the world. This cannot be said of many other countries. But where we have done less well is that many of our peers 70 years ago have done economically much better and have faced the challenge of poverty much better than we have. Now, for many decades, we used to brush away those comparisons by saying that the Southeast Asian tiger economies were small countries and that it was not comparable to compare with a large country like India. But that changed with what has happened with China in the last 3.5 decades. So if you turn the clock back to the late 1970s, it's a very interesting situation. China and India, the only two countries which today have more than 1 billion population, in the late 70s had a per capita income more or less in the same range. Now, since then, the Chinese economy grew dramatically faster, not faster just than the Indian economy, but more or less any other economy in the world. And it reached a level where the Chinese economy went up to 5.5 times of India's economy, from being more or less on par at a per capita basis. Now, this was because in a country where they did not have democracy, where they do not have to carry millions of people in changing policies, if only the top 5 or 6 people get convinced of a change, they can implement it. What China did, starting with Deng Xiaoping and several of his successor leaders, is turn around their economic policies to a much more market-friendly, competitive environment, pushed the gas pedal to the floor and kept it there for 3 decades. So that with double-digit growth over 3.5 decades, you've reached this scenario where they went to 5.5 times of our economy and did a much better job of reducing poverty and a much better job of creating jobs. Now, that is a window that we missed. There is no point talking about what could have happened in the 80s and 90s and 10 or 15 years ago. Now, interestingly, in the last 25 years, since we started our economic reforms, we haven't exactly been a slouch either. India has gradually shifted up its growth rate from the derisively called Hindu rate of growth in the 50s and 60s to now being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and in many quarters being the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now, the reason this is important is we have for too long got stuck in a debate in our country justifying growth. I have seen in my 17.5 years in Parliament, finance minister after finance minister after finance minister having to justify why growth is important. This is the real tragedy that we had to face, because there are legitimate arguments that growth alone is not sufficient, that there has to be inclusive growth, and that large sections of our population have to be carried upwards by the growth. But to question growth itself point I'm trying to make is, it is legitimate to argue that growth is necessary but not sufficient. But to question growth is what has cost us a lot of lost time. Now, fortunately, that is changing. And despite hiccups, when we have seen our growth go up and go down, we are approaching a level today where growth seems to be, at least in the last quarter, we have seen it bounce back from the disruptions caused by policies which I believe will have long-term positive effects, although they had short-term disruptions. Let me give you some good news and some bad news. The good news is, while the Chinese economy went up to 5.5 times of the Indian economy, some publications globally, such as The Economist, predicted that it would go up even further and that it would become 6 times of the Indian economy. That didn't happen. What has actually happened is Chinese growth, after many decades of double-digit growth, seems to be stabilizing over the past 3 or 4 years. And Indian growth has been picking up, although not consistently, but in fits and starts. And as a result, the ratio has somewhat improved in India's favor, slightly. So from 5.5 times, today's ratio is only about 5 times of, so Chinese economy is about 5 times of Indian economy. And we need to, of course, catch up a lot. It will take time. The differential growth rates will only kick in over the next decade or 2 decades before we can even dream about going back to the per capita parity that we used to enjoy back in the late 1970s. Now, as I've said before, growth is important. It should not be questioned, but it can't be enough, because we do need to uplift millions of people. And as has been pointed out by many pundits, economists of the highest order, such as Lord Desai here, we have others like Bibek, we have Jagdish Bhagwati in Colombia, that indeed growth has helped millions, in fact hundreds of millions, to be brought out of dire poverty. But we need to do a lot more. Now, Bibek in his talk mentioned the 4 areas of land, capital, entrepreneurship, and labor laws. I don't want to go over all of them again, but I do wish to emphasize labor laws. I have come from a corporate background where I can tell you, not just I, but all my colleagues bent over backwards to not create jobs. Because the hassle of dealing with the labor laws is such a disincentive that we would do economically less rational things, like invest in equipment where manual labor actually would have been cheaper and more cost effective. We bent over backwards, and even today when I talk to people around the country, you will see they may not say it specifically. Many economists may not focus on the issue so much anymore. But our labor laws are not just a problem because they only cater to 8% of labor. I mean, if we then take that forward and say the other 92% who are not in the formal sector should be covered by similar labor laws, we will do a terrible damage and terrible disservice. We do need labor laws. We do need to protect our people. But as Bhagwati and Panagaria have written, of the about 200 labor laws in the country, it is impossible to abide by all. You can be sure that if you are abiding by some, you are in fact violating some others. We need to have labor laws to protect people, but there must be a fine balance where we do not disincentivize the creation of jobs. And until we do that, we are not going to be creating enough jobs. But the bad news I have for you is that everything that we do, we are trying to make up. Labor laws have not yet been reformed at the national level, but at the state level, efforts are being made in several states. Growth is beginning to catch up. The ease of doing business index shows that India is rapidly improving as a place that attracts investment, which will undoubtedly create jobs. But after a lot of effort, we have just cracked the top 100. The Prime Minister, 3 years ago when he got sworn in, announced a goal that India ought not to be in the 140 odd rank, should be in the top 50. It has taken us 3 years to come into the top 100. the goal of getting into the top 50 will require more heavy lifting. To do away with a lot of red tape, to do away with a lot of hurdles in the way of investment and job creation. Some work is being done. Recently, the government announced that something like 1,200 obsolete laws, many of them going back to the 19th century, have been repealed. Laws which perpetuate the license permit inspector Raj, who come and inspect whether your factories have lime painting on the walls or not. These will help, but we need to do more. If we are not in the top 50, and if we don't set our sights on being in the top 20 and the top 10 in the ease of doing business index, we are not going to be able to create the number of jobs that we require. But the really bad news is, no matter what we do, the same level of high growth rates will no longer create the same number of jobs. Today we are back up to above 6% growth rate, and I am firmly convinced that because of the structural changes made by introducing GST and many other steps, we are going to reach 7%, maybe 8%, and it's possible we'll go beyond that as well. But 7% or 8% or even 10% growth rate no longer creates the same number of jobs that it would have created in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because of what I mentioned, because of automation, because of robotics, because of machine learning. China maintained more than 10% growth rate for more than 3 decades and created hundreds of millions of jobs. Now, even if we go to 10% and keep it up for 3 decades, it's a good thing, we should do it. We must have high growth rates. It will lead to many other benefits. It will lead to revenues going up. It will lead to resources being available for infrastructure and many other benefits. But we must reconcile to the fact that today's economic profile in the 21st century will create less number of jobs, apple to apple, for the same growth rates that in the past used to create many more jobs. Now, how do we overcome this? Does that mean we give up on this? Of course not. Of course we must build more infrastructure. Of course we must ease our red tape. Of course we must go up higher on the ease of doing business index. And on all of these fronts, efforts are being made, and you can see that day in and day out. If you sift through a lot of narrative and commentary which has very strong biases, if you look at it more neutrally, you will find that lots is happening. For example, an objective measure is that we have gone up a dramatic number of places on the ease of doing business index, and you can see other such objective measures such as Moody's upward rating of our sovereign debt profile. But if we are to face up to the jobs challenge, while we should do all of these things, while we should encourage entrepreneurship, while we should ease access to credit and capital, while we should invest in skills training, which are crucial, we will still have a shortfall. And one of the ideas that is making the rounds over the last few years is a universal basic income, a UBI. Now, ironically, the UBI, which sounds like a socialistic idea, actually comes from many capitalists. It comes from Silicon Valley, people who are creating this joblessness because of automation, because of artificial intelligence, because of machine learning. Now, I have been inspired by talks with several economists around the world to advocate for a universal basic income. I first wrote about it, and I believe I was the first one in Parliament at least, to highlight it 2 years ago, and then I have been writing repeatedly and advocating it. Now, I just want to say a few things and wrap up, because this is not the forum to talk at length about UBI. But if you're interested, please Google. I have written articles and given interviews which go into it more in detail, and there are many eminent economists who have written at great length on it. If we are to keep people out of poverty, a bare minimum payment would do that. And the estimate in India is to keep them above the so-called Tendulkar poverty line is 1,000 rupees a person per month. Now, while UBI is being debated internationally as something that's difficult to achieve because you have to cut other social service expenditures, in India, I believe it's a much easier deal, simply because The social expenditure that we have is so inefficient. I want to remind you something that a Prime Minister said 30 years ago. The then Prime Minister in 1985 said that out of every rupee that the government spends, only 15 paisa reaches the citizen. 85 paisa goes away in salaries, wages, overheads, and corruption and leakage. Do you know what that number is today? It has actually improved, but not by that much. I keep a track of this, and depending on the government scheme that you analyze, whether it is public distribution system, PDS, or others, somewhere between 40 to 73% never reaches the citizen. Out of every rupee that we spend from taxpayers' money from the government, somewhere between 40 to 73 paisa does not reach the citizen, depending on the scheme, depending on the region. That is a terrible, terrible inefficiency. But I think it's also an opportunity. Western countries don't have that level of inefficiency. And so if they had to cut something, it would pinch in order to provide a universal basic income. We have the ability, and we are seeing that with technology, with biometrics, with Aadhaar-linked transition to subsidies from physical handouts by government to a regime of direct cash into the hands of citizens. And you are seeing dramatic improvements with just the few schemes that have been started, such as the LPG cooking gas cylinders being transitioned to cash transfer. Nandan Nilekani announced just a few weeks ago that $9 billion have already been saved in saving the inefficiencies. I believe that using a similar methodology of biometrics-linked direct cash transfers, we can both save on governmental expenditures. In other words, we will improve the fiscal deficit, which improves the country's credit ratings. And at the same time, we will be able to afford something like a universal basic income. Couple of other questions. Why should it be universal? Why should people like us get it? Answer is very simple. I have seen how these government schemes are handed out. There are armies of people, officers out in the fields evaluating who is a likely candidate. They look for whether you have electricity, whether you live in a thatched hut or a concrete home, whether you have a bicycle or a motorcycle. Tremendous wasted effort and a lot of inefficiency and corruption. People have to pay bribes to get listed that they do actually have a thatched home. If you make it universal and you say that you have to go to the local kirana shop, give your biometrics and collect 1,000 rupees, people like us won't do it. Those who really need it will go and collect that 1,000 rupees and be above destitution. That's why universal and not targeted, because targeting is a huge wasted effort. So I will conclude by saying that we will need something like a universal basic income, because all the efforts that we are making, laudable, will have results, will pay off in the long run, will not be enough in the short and medium term to keep hundreds of millions of us above the poverty level. And a universal basic income is better affordable in India than most other countries, simply because of the inefficiencies we have already had. And the final argument is, will it make people disinclined to work? Well, if you pay them 50,000 rupees a month, yes, it might. Pay them 1,000 rupees a month to just keep them out of destitution? No. I spend nearly 2 weeks every month, month in, month out, with people in my constituency and in other constituencies. No. 1,000 rupees will indeed be dramatically useful to keep them out of poverty, but it will not take away their incentive to work. This, apart from all the other things of creating infrastructure, making it easier to invest and create jobs, this is what we must do to have a job-generative economic agenda. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Incessant book writer that Bibek is, I have in my hand his latest book, Ideas for India, and may I request Mr. Panda to kindly release this book, Bibek. Now I request Dr. Ratan Roy to share his thoughts on the book. You can do it from here or there, whichever.
Good morning, everyone, and distinguished panelists. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to reacquaint myself in one place with what Bibek has been writing over the past 10 odd years. No, more than that, 13 years. 13 odd years, right? Your columns go back. Because, you know, like most other economists, certainly political economists like myself, you may not agree with everything he writes, but you always read it. Because as Mr. Desai was saying, I don't use the honorific, I'm a Republican. As Mr. Desai was saying, it is very difficult to read anything he writes that does not spark an original thought. And I think the best tribute I can pay to this intellectual legacy from which I've benefited hugely is to take forward something that he said and which touches upon something Mr. Panda said, which I hope we will work on going forward in the council together, and will also spark some more provocative columns from which I shall benefit. You see, I think over the last 23 years, what is remarkable for me is one stark thing, which is that auto sales, cars and two-wheelers, if you will, have become a leading indicator of the Indian economy. And whether you like it or not, cars and two-wheelers are not what the majority of Indians consume. So it is a peculiarity when a leading indicator of the Indian economy for the people from Bombay becomes this sector. I'm not saying it's a bad or good thing, it's a peculiarity. And since Bibek's work always identifies these peculiarities, I'm trying to follow in his footsteps and ask, so if I ask ourselves what should be the leading indicators of the Indian economy, I would then proceed to ask, what is it that all Indians, not poor Indians or rich Indians, all Indians tend to consume in full measure? And I have a short list of 5, you may add to them. We consume food, and there is a food chain going from cereals to proteins, and we all try and make the best we can of this food chain. We try and consume fruit, vegetables, dal, if you're non-vegetarian, eggs, chicken, I won't go beyond that. And there's a food chain there. That's what basically all Indians consume. And to facilitate this consumption, we have created a huge number of subsidies, which means that when it comes to food, we have 2 problems. We are either peripatetically, from time to time, importing large quantities of it to facilitate consumption, or we are subsidizing its production and consumption. So we're not very clear whether we are at a place where all Indians are able to consume food at affordable prices. With clothing, I find it even more peculiar. We seem to be reasonably successful at producing clothing for the likes of the people on this dais, but remarkably unsuccessful in producing clothing for the common person. And when I investigated this, I found the majority of clothing for the common person, if you go to a market in Delhi called Sarojini Nagar, comes from 2 countries, not China, from Bangladesh and Vietnam. So we are uncompetitive in the place where there is huge aggregate demand. We tend to import. Low-cost housing, till this Prime Minister came into the picture, was not even on the map. We've made a huge beginning with it, and that is exciting because all Indians consume housing, but only some Indians were allowed to consume housing until recently. So finding affordable, low-cost housing for all Indians becomes a 3rd feature. The 4th would be education. I'll be brief. Our business model is broken. You tell me to throw money at it. As a finance guy, I would. If you told me what you would do with the money, we don't know. Health, we have a slightly better idea, but our business model there is broken too. So I think going forward to 2030, to get the $10 trillion, $4,000 per capita economy that Bibek was referring to, with or without a universal basic income, it will have to be the case that a good India will be one in which all people of India are able to consume these 5 things, and it is the growth in these 5 things that populates the majority of that 8 or 9 or 7 or whatever, and that will surely be jobful. I do not see automation taking away jobs in agriculture, low-end clothing, and certainly not in health and education with any luck. We should be competitive for at least 2 generations there. So if you're able to do this, then the conundrum that Bibek has posed, which is very challenging, what will India be as a $10 trillion economy at $4,000 per capita? I think the happy answer to that conundrum would be a change in production and consumption patterns that gives us these 5 things which we have not so far succeeded in delivering to all Indians, rich and poor, since 1991. I hope I have paid my tribute to Bibek in terms of his legacy. There is one more feature I would commend to you in his columns and in his work, which I want to emphasize, which he has chosen not to today, which is his work on governance and more narrowly on public administration. He has always patiently explained to me when I've expressed impatience that it takes a long time to reform public administration. To the relatively older amongst us, I guess we have become used to bad government and we can live with it. Government here is very bad, let's admit it. The quality of government is bad. Rules, norms, these things are being changed. But I would like to leave a thought with the younger people and perhaps something you could engage with Bibek with. How long are you willing to put up with bad, essentially feudal government and continue to throw money at it and not get results? Because if that does not come, the priors that I mentioned will not come. And one of the things that inhibits us, causes these armies to go out and collect data, target, etc., which is essentially an acceptance of feudalism, will not go away. So this also has to change, and if you read between the lines in a lot of what Bibek has written, you will find him consistently, quietly, and much more strategically than me. I'm a blunt chap posing this question, and it is that ultimate tribute to a true polymath and political economist that I want to pay to him, and I commend his book to you. Thank you.
I now invite Dr. Lavish Bhandari to give his perspective on the book.
Distinguished panelists, distinguished delegates, friends. It's always a problem coming in last after all the eulogies have been done. But I also happen to have worked a lot with Bibek in many other studies, reports, and a whole lot of other things that we have done together for many years. Apart from those, I also happen to have interacted quite intensively with Bibek on many aspects of the Indian economy. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the character of this book, and I'll draw from that. So first, and I think that's the most interesting thing about Bibek's way that he looks at it, he handles each problem like a diamond. So if you pick up any of the chapters or monographs in this book, essentially he takes a problem and he looks at all the facets of that problem. It may come in from history, it may come in from technology, it could be the governance issue, the policy issue, and could also be purely the mundane facts associated with that problem. So for a reader who's not really clued into that particular issue, you really get a very good perspective. So the second part about Bibek's writing is that it's very, very crisp. So if you are one of those fast readers, it won't work. So you have to read a bit slowly because it does take a little bit of effort to be able to digest all that he has to there. There is a lot of knowledge there. He has essentially brought in his whole understanding of the laws, the governance issues, all the discussions that he has with various people, whether they are private sector professionals or for that matter within the government. The third part, which I think was really interesting about this book, is the whole gamut of things that is covered. In fact, it's you just read this whole book, and in a sense, it gives you a very, very intense look at the Indian economy and how various facets operate. I'd like to draw from just one part of this particular set of characteristics. And what really this whole book is about simplicity. The Honorable Minister did speak about how important it is to get the capital output ratios and entrepreneurism, etc., all of that together. Mr. Panda also spoke about this whole problem that entrepreneurs have about not being able to, or not really incentivized to hire. It all boils down to having a simple set of rules. And in a sense, all this book talks about is simplicity. So whether it is the chapter on GST or whether it is a chapter on the various other laws and rules and regulations governing the private sector, whether it is the public-private interface, whether it is purely simple policy issues, it's all governed by one inherent thing that Bibek always stands for, and that is, let's keep it simple. So with that, I'd like to stop. I really don't think I can say much more than that, but thank you very much.
So I thank the panel and thank all of you. while we break for tea, we will reassemble at 11:45. So do go to the exhibition and do the voting. At 11:45, the exhibition will close. The guards will be put there, and everybody is expected to join back in the hall. And while we break for tea, I invite the speakers to just come together here for one group photo, please. Thank you very much. All speakers to join us backstage for tea. Nirmal, could you kindly bring Pranjal, Ashima?